Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest power to heal a broken heart. In a world that overlooks the forgotten, one man's act would change everything. When 65-year-old cowboy Jack Mallory shocked everyone by bidding $1 on Biscuit, the runt nobody wanted, townspeople thought the old man had lost his mind. They were wrong. Jack saw something in that chubby mutt others missed: redemption. With his ranch quiet and no family, Jack had a plan. He would train Biscuit for therapy work, bringing hope to nursing homes, schools, and prisons. What Jack didn't expect was how this partnership would heal his relationship with his brother and mend wounds in the community. Could a dollar dog be worth more than anyone imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Mallory ranch, its golden light revealing what time had claimed and what it had left behind. Jack Mallory stood on his weathered porch, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching the empty pastures where cattle once grazed in peaceful abundance. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was familiar, like an old friend who'd overstayed his welcome but couldn't quite bring himself to leave. At 65, Jack bore the kind of weathered dignity that came from 4 decades of honest work under the Montana sky. His face was a map of seasons, lines carved by winter winds, darkened by summer sun, softened by the gentle wisdom that settles into a man who's seen enough of life to understand its true rhythms. His hands, large and gentle, spoke of countless mornings spent gentling spooked horses and mending broken fence posts. The ranch house itself seemed to exhale memories. Built by his grandfather in 1923, its log walls had witnessed 3 generations of Mallory men who'd worked this land with varying degrees of success and satisfaction. Jack's father had expanded the operation in the boom years following World War II, adding the red barn that still stood proud against the horizon, though its paint had faded to the color of old roses. Inside the house, everything remained exactly as it had been when Jack's wife Martha passed 5 years ago. Her reading glasses still sat on the kitchen windowsill next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her coffee mug, the one with the faded image of a mountain sunrise, waited in the cabinet untouched but not forgotten. Jack had learned that grief wasn't something you got over. It was something you grew around, like a tree healing around an old fence wire. He walked to his desk in the small office off the living room, where his worn leather ranch journal lay open to yesterday's entry. The journal had been his constant companion for 37 years, documenting everything from cattle births to market prices, from weather patterns to the small victories and defeats that made up a rancher's life. The leather cover was soft with age and handling, stained by coffee rings and marked by the indentations of countless pen strokes. Jack ran his thumb along the journal's edge, feeling the accumulated weight of all those recorded days. Each page represented a choice, a moment when he'd decided something was worth remembering. The early entries were filled with the enthusiasm of a young man building something lasting. The middle years chronicled the peak of the operation. Detailed breeding records, expansion plans, notes about Martha's garden, and their dreams of children who never came. The recent entries were sparse. Fence repair, south pasture. Vet visit for old Rex. Called about hay delivery, the bare bones of a life still lived but no longer fully embraced. He flipped back to an entry from 1987, written in his younger self's confident hand. Delivered 47 head to the Johnson Ranch today. Tom helped with the drive, never seen him handle cattle with such natural instinct. Martha says he gets it from Dad's side, but I think he learned it from watching me. We make a good team, my little brother and I. Stop for coffee at May's Diner afterward. Tom talked about maybe starting his own operation someday. I told him there's always room for another Mallory ranch in this valley. The memory stung with the peculiar pain of happiness recalled from a great distance. Tom, 2 years younger but somehow always seeming older, more serious, burdened by expectations that Jack had never quite understood. Their father had seen something in Tom that promised responsibility and discipline, qualities that might have saved the family ranch from the economic pressures that eventually forced its sale. But life, Jack had learned, rarely unfolds according to anyone's plans. The town of Cedar Falls sat 15 miles east of the ranch. Population 1247, according to the weathered sign at the city limits. It was the kind of place where 3 generations might shop at the same grocery store, where the hardware store owner knew exactly which screws you needed for a gate repair before you finished describing the problem, where the annual 4th of July parade still drew crowds despite featuring more antique tractors than horses. Jack drove there twice a week for supplies and social contact, though the social part had dwindled over the years. At May's Diner, the same gathering of local ranchers, retirees, and shop owners occupied their customary tables, discussing weather, politics, and the gradual changes that seemed to creep over their community like slow-moving shadows. "Morning, Jack!" May Hendricks called from behind the counter as he entered. May had inherited the diner from her parents 23 years ago and had maintained it with the same unflinching dedication to strong coffee and homemade pie that had made it a town institution. "Morning, May. How's the coffee today?" "Same as always. Strong enough to float a horseshoe and twice as reliable." She poured him a cup without being asked, a small kindness that Jack appreciated more than he let on. At the corner table, 3 men looked up from their conversation. Pete Nordstrom, who ran the feed store, Bill Travers, a retired postal worker, and Dr. Robert Chen, the town's veterinarian and one of the few relative newcomers, having arrived only 15 years ago from somewhere back east. "Jack," Pete nodded. "Heard you made quite a splash at yesterday's auction." The comment drew chuckles from the other men. The kind of gentle ribbing that passed for entertainment in small towns where everyone's business was known before supper time. "That's one way to put it," Jack replied, settling into an empty chair. He'd expected this conversation. "Dollar for that little butterball." Bill shook his head. "What you planning to do with him? Bacon and eggs?" Dr. Chen smiled but said nothing, his expression thoughtful. Jack had always respected the veterinarian's tendency to observe before judging, a quality that served him well in both his professional and social interactions. "Every animal deserves a chance," Jack said simply. "True enough," Pete agreed. "But that little fella looked like he'd be more comfortable in someone's living room than on a working ranch." The conversation continued in the easy, unhurried way of men who had nowhere pressing to be and had learned to find entertainment in the small dramas of their neighbors' lives. Jack listened more than he contributed, filing away information about crop prices, weather forecasts, and the latest developments in the ongoing saga of the county commissioner's attempts to modernize the aging courthouse. But his mind kept drifting to the dog, Biscuit. According to the auction paperwork, who was currently exploring his new home with the cautious optimism of a creature who'd learned not to expect too much from life. There had been something in the dog's eyes, a gentle intelligence that reminded Jack of the best horses he'd ever worked with, animals who seemed to understand not just commands, but intentions, who could sense human emotions with uncanny accuracy. As he drove home, Jack found himself thinking about purpose. For most of his adult life, purpose had been clear and immediate. Cattle to tend, fences to repair, seasons to prepare for and survive. The rhythm of ranch work had provided structure and meaning, a daily confirmation that his presence in the world mattered in tangible, measurable ways. Since Martha's death and the ranch's downsizing, purpose had become more elusive. He still maintained the property, still fixed what broke and tended what grew, but the work felt more like maintenance than mission. He was keeping things going rather than building toward something. The ranch came into view as he crested the hill, and Jack felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied his homecomings now. Not sadness exactly, but a recognition of what had been lost and what remained. The house still stood solid and welcoming. The barn still provided shelter. The land still held its quiet beauty. But the sense of forward momentum, of lives being built and dreams being pursued, had departed with Martha and the cattle. He parked near the kitchen door and sat for a moment in the truck's cab, gathering himself for the evening routine that had become as predictable as the sunrise. Feed the horses, check the water troughs, secure the gates. Then dinner alone, while the radio provided background voices to fill the silence. But tonight would be different. Tonight, there would be Biscuit. As if summoned by the thought, the little dog appeared around the corner of the house, moving with the careful optimism of an animal still learning to trust his new circumstances. Biscuit was indeed chubby, his short legs working hard to support his round belly, his tail wagging with the enthusiastic uncertainty of a creature eager to please but unsure of the rules. Jack climbed out of the truck and knelt down, extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful intention. Biscuit approached slowly, his brown eyes, warm and intelligent, fixed on Jack's face as if trying to read some essential truth there. "Well, boy," Jack said softly, "looks like we're going to figure this out together." The dog's tail wagged harder, and he pressed his head into Jack's palm with the gentle insistence of an animal who'd been waiting his whole life for exactly this kind of recognition. Standing up, Jack looked out over his land, the empty pastures, the quiet barn, the fading afternoon light that painted everything in shades of gold and amber. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something stirring in his chest that wasn't loneliness or regret, but possibility. The Leather Ranch Journal would have a more interesting entry tonight. 3 days after the auction, Jack found himself in Dr. Chen's veterinary clinic with Biscuit, tucked securely in a borrowed pet carrier that seemed almost comically small for the dog's rotund frame. The morning drive to town had been punctuated by curious glances from passers-by who'd clearly heard about his unusual purchase and were eager to see the famous dollar dog for themselves. "So this is the fellow who's got the whole town talking," Dr. Chen said, his kind eyes crinkling with gentle amusement as he examined the paperwork from the auction. "Biscuit, is it?" "That's what they called him," Jack replied, watching as the veterinarian coaxed the nervous dog from the carrier with practiced patience. "Though I suspect that had more to do with his appetite than his pedigree." Dr. Chen's examination was thorough and gentle, his hands moving with the confident touch of someone who'd spent decades earning the trust of anxious animals. Biscuit submitted to the inspection with remarkable calm, occasionally glancing at Jack as if seeking reassurance that this was all part of some benevolent plan. "Well," Dr. Chen said finally, updating the medical chart that would become Biscuit's official health record, "he's overweight, certainly. About 15 pounds more than he should be carrying. His joints show some stress from the extra weight, and his breathing is a bit labored during exertion. But underneath all that—" He paused, scratching behind Biscuit's ears with obvious affection. "This is a remarkably well-tempered animal. His response to handling suggests someone socialized him properly as a puppy. What's his story, you think?" "Hard to say for certain. Mixed breed. I see some beagle, maybe some basset hound, definitely some terrier in there. He's probably 4 or 5 years old. The weight suggests he's been fed regularly, possibly overfed by someone who cared about him but didn't understand proper nutrition. My guess, family dog who ended up at the shelter when circumstances changed. Divorce, death, financial hardship, the usual sad stories." Jack absorbed this information, while Biscuit explored the examination room with cautious curiosity. The dog's movements were deliberate and thoughtful, his attention drawn repeatedly to a framed photograph of Dr. Chen's own dogs that sat on the counter. "What caught your eye about him?" Dr. Chen asked, genuinely curious. "At the auction, I mean. Pete Nordstrom said you bid." Without hesitation, Jack considered the question, searching for words to explain an instinct that had operated faster than rational thought. "Hard to say exactly. Something about how he watched the other dogs getting chosen. He wasn't frantic or desperate like some of them, just patient, like he understood the situation and was willing to wait for the right person to notice him." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Dogs often know things we don't. This one certainly seems to have good judgment about people." He handed Jack a folder containing Biscuit's new medical records, vaccination schedule, and dietary recommendations. "He'll need to lose that weight gradually. Too fast, and it's hard on his system. Good quality food, measured portions, regular exercise. Nothing too strenuous at first. As they prepared to leave, the clinic's front door opened, and a woman entered with a small girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The child's face was streaked with tears, her small shoulders shaking with the particular kind of grief that seemed too large for such a tiny frame. "Dr. Chen," the woman said, her voice carefully controlled, "we're here about Patches." The veterinarian's expression grew somber. "Of course. Please, come in." Jack gathered Biscuit's leash and prepared to leave, but the little girl had spotted the dog, and her crying gradually subsided into curious sniffles. Biscuit, for his part, seemed to sense the child's distress with uncanny accuracy. Without any prompting from Jack, he approached her slowly, his tail wagging gently, his posture utterly non-threatening. "Can I pet him?" the girl asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack knelt down beside Biscuit, keeping the leash loose. "His name is Biscuit, and he's very gentle. Would you like to say hello?" The girl extended her small hand, and Biscuit pressed his head against her palm, with the same gentle insistence he'd shown Jack 3 days earlier. Something magical happened in that moment. The child's face brightened, her breathing steadied, and for just a few seconds, her grief was replaced by wonder. "He's so soft," she said, running her fingers through Biscuit's fur. "And he feels warm." Her mother watched with grateful eyes as her daughter experienced a moment of comfort in what Jack sensed was a very difficult day. Dr. Chen emerged from the back room, his expression professionally gentle but unmistakably sad. "Patches is very sick, Emma," he said to the little girl. "We need to help her so she won't hurt anymore. Do you understand?" Emma nodded solemnly, but her hand remained on Biscuit's head as if drawing strength from the contact. "Will it hurt?" "No, sweetheart. She'll just go to sleep, very peacefully." The girl looked up at Jack with the kind of direct honesty that only children possess. "Are you going to take good care of Biscuit?" "I am," Jack promised, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "Good. He makes people feel better." As they left the clinic, Jack found himself profoundly moved by the encounter. There had been something almost mystical about Biscuit's response to the grieving child, an intuitive understanding that went beyond ordinary animal behavior. The dog hadn't just been friendly, he'd been therapeutic. The drive home gave Jack time to process what he'd witnessed. He'd always been good with animals, had always understood that they possessed emotional intelligence that humans often underestimated. But Biscuit's interaction with Emma had revealed something deeper, a natural capacity for healing that seemed almost purposeful. That evening, Jack sat on his porch with Biscuit beside him, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. The medical records lay on the table next to his chair, filled with clinical details about vaccinations and dietary requirements. But Jack was thinking about something that couldn't be measured or documented, the way Biscuit had known exactly what Emma needed and had provided it without hesitation. "You know, boy," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "I think maybe there's more to this than I originally thought." Biscuit's tail thumped against the porch boards, and he leaned into Jack's touch with contentment that seemed to radiate outward like warmth from a fireplace. Jack had spent most of his adult life working with animals, understanding their needs, reading their moods, helping them reach their potential. Cattle, horses, even the barn cats who'd appointed themselves guardians of the grain store, all had benefited from his patient attention and instinctive understanding of their nature. But this felt different. This felt like purpose. He thought about the nursing home on the outskirts of town, where Martha had volunteered before her illness. She'd often spoken about the residents there, proud, independent people who'd been forced by age and circumstance into lives of increasing isolation. Many of them had grown up on ranches and farms, had worked with animals their entire lives. How might they respond to a visit from a gentle, patient dog who seemed to understand loneliness? The idea took shape slowly, like dawn breaking over the mountains. Therapy dogs. He'd heard about such programs in larger cities, Animals trained to provide comfort in hospitals, nursing homes, schools. Dogs who offered what medicine couldn't. Unconditional acceptance, wordless comfort, the simple healing power of non-judgmental presence. Could Biscuit be trained for such work? Could an overweight, overlooked mutt become something more significant than anyone had imagined? Jack pulled out his phone and after a moment's hesitation dialed Dr. Chen's number. "Robert, it's Jack Mallory. I have a question about therapy dog training. Do you know anything about the certification process?" There was a pause, then a chuckle. "You know, Jack, I was wondering if you might call about that. After what I saw today with Emma, I have to say the idea crossed my mind too. There are definitely programs available, though it requires commitment from both dog and owner." "I've got time," Jack said, looking out over his quiet ranch. "And I think maybe this little guy has more to offer than anyone realized. I think you might be right. Let me make some calls tomorrow, see what I can find out about the requirements. But Jack, you should know that therapy work isn't easy. It requires patience, consistency, and the ability to handle situations that can be emotionally challenging." Jack thought about Emma's tear-streaked face, about the quiet desperation he'd seen in the nursing home during Martha's illness, about his own need for something that mattered beyond the daily maintenance of an increasingly solitary life. "I understand," he said. "We'll do whatever it takes." After he ended the call, Jack sat in the gathering darkness with Biscuit's warm weight pressed against his leg. For the first time since Martha's death, he felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind of hope that demands specific outcomes, but the patient, steady variety that simply trusts in the possibility of better things. The medical records on the table represented more than just a dog's health history. They were the beginning of a transformation that Jack was only starting to understand, not just for Biscuit, but for himself as well. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Pete Nordstrom himself, who'd taken to volunteering for mail runs just to satisfy his curiosity about Jack's latest project. The box contained a professional training collar and leash set, soft blue nylon with adjustable fittings and reinforced stitching, the kind of equipment that suggested serious intention rather than casual pet ownership. "That's some fancy gear for a dollar dog," Pete observed, lingering on the porch longer than necessary. Jack signed for the package with patient good humor. Word of his therapy dog plans had spread through Cedar Falls with the efficiency of a grass fire, generating reactions that ranged from amused skepticism to outright bewilderment. The general consensus seemed to be that grief and isolation had finally addled Jack Mallory's common sense. "Every dog deserves proper equipment," Jack replied, examining the collar's padding and hardware. The manufacturer's information card mentioned their commitment to supporting the vital work of therapy animals and their handlers. It felt official, purposeful, exactly what Jack needed to begin taking this seriously. Biscuit watched the proceedings with intelligent interest, his tail wagging as Jack knelt to fit the new collar around his neck. The adjustment process revealed the extent of their journey ahead. The collar's smallest setting was still too large for Biscuit's neck, requiring an additional hole punched with Jack's leather working tools. "We've got some work to do, boy," Jack murmured, testing the fit. "But we'll get there." The training manual Dr. Chen had recommended outlined a systematic approach to therapy dog preparation that was both more complex and more encouraging than Jack had expected. Basic obedience formed the foundation: sit, stay, come, heel. But therapy work required additional skills: remaining calm in crowded environments, accepting handling from strangers, ignoring distractions, and responding appropriately to unexpected sounds or movements. Their first formal training session took place in the barn, away from distractions and with plenty of space for movement. Jack had worked with countless animals over the years, but training a dog for therapy work required a different approach than gentling horses or managing cattle. This wasn't about dominance or control, but about building a partnership based on trust and communication. Biscuit proved to be an eager student. though his enthusiasm sometimes outpaced his attention span. The basic sit command came easily, too easily. As Jack discovered, when the dog began sitting preemptively whenever Jack reached into the treat pouch, regardless of what command had actually been given. That's not exactly how this works, Jack laughed. Watching Biscuit maintain a perfect sitting position while his eyes remained fixed on the treat pouch with laser-like intensity. Progress came in small increments. Walking on a leash without pulling required patience and consistency as Biscuit gradually learned that forward movement only happened when the leash remained slack. The stay command proved more challenging, as Biscuit's natural inclination was to follow Jack wherever he went, a trait that would actually be valuable in therapy work but needed to be refined and controlled. After a week of daily sessions, Jack felt ready to attempt their first public outing. The town's small library seemed like an ideal starting point. Quiet, controlled environment, limited number of people, familiar staff who might be understanding if things didn't go perfectly. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had known Jack since he was a boy, checking out books about horses and cattle ranching. She greeted their arrival with the kind of polite curiosity that suggested she'd heard about his therapy dog project but wasn't quite sure what to make of it. He's certainly well behaved, she observed, as Biscuit walked calmly beside Jack. His new collar and leash marking him as a dog with a job to do. The test came when another patron entered the library, an elderly man using a walker who moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose balance couldn't be taken for granted. Biscuit's ears perked up with interest, but he remained in position beside Jack, waiting for direction. Mr. Henderson, Jack greeted the newcomer, whom he recognized from May's diner. I'd like you to meet Biscuit. George Henderson paused in his progress toward the mystery novel section, his weathered face breaking into a smile. So this is the famous dollar dog. Mind if I say hello? Jack gave Biscuit the hand signal they'd been practicing for meet and greet, a subtle gesture that released the dog from his stay position while maintaining the expectation of gentle behavior. Biscuit approached Mr. Henderson slowly, his tail wagging but his movements carefully controlled. The old man's face lit up as he reached down to pet Biscuit's head. Reminds me of a dog I had growing up on the ranch. Same gentle eyes. What's he training for? Therapy work, Jack explained. Visiting nursing homes, maybe schools. Animals can provide comfort in ways that people sometimes can't. Mr. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. My late wife would have loved this idea. She always said dogs were better listeners than most people. He continued petting Biscuit, who seemed content to receive the attention indefinitely. This one's got good instincts. Doesn't push too hard, doesn't back away when you need him close. The successful interaction boosted Jack's confidence, but their next outing proved more challenging. The weekly farmers' market brought crowds, noise, and a sensory overload that tested both Biscuit's training and Jack's patience. Children ran between the booths, vendors called out their wares, and the scents of food and flowers created a distracting symphony of stimulation. Biscuit handled the initial exposure well, walking steadily beside Jack and maintaining his focus despite the chaos. But when a toddler broke free from his parents and ran directly toward them with the uninhibited enthusiasm of childhood, Biscuit's excitement overcame his training. He pulled toward the child, tail wagging furiously, disrupting their careful heel position and nearly knocking over a display of late-season tomatoes. Sorry, Jack apologized to the vendor while re-establishing control over an overstimulated Biscuit. We're still working on crowd control. The vendor, a woman in her 60s with soil-stained hands and understanding eyes, smiled warmly. Are you Jack Mallory? I heard about your therapy dog project. I'm Sarah Collins. I taught elementary school here for 32 years before I retired to grow vegetables full-time. Something about Sarah's voice. Calm. Patient with the particular quality that suggested years of managing excited children seemed to have an immediate effect on Biscuit. His attention shifted to her, his body language relaxing into the focused but gentle demeanor they'd been working to achieve. He's responding to you, Jack observed with interest. Dogs and children have similar needs, Sarah replied, crouching down to Biscuit's level. "Clear expectations, consistent boundaries, and plenty of positive reinforcement. May I?" She gestured toward Biscuit, and Jack nodded. Sarah's interaction with Biscuit was masterful. She established eye contact, spoke in low, soothing tones, and used gentle but confident hand movements that communicated both affection and authority. Biscuit settled into a perfect sit position without being asked, his attention completely focused on this new person who clearly understood how to communicate with him. "You know," Sarah said, standing up with the careful movements of someone whose knees had logged too many years, kneeling at child height, "I've been looking for a volunteer opportunity since I retired. The garden keeps my hands busy, but I miss working with young minds. If you need help with training, I might be interested." Jack studied Sarah's face, seeing something there that reminded him of Martha's natural way with animals and people alike. "What do you know about therapy dog training?" "Nothing official," Sarah admitted. "But I know about patience, consistency, and building trust. I know about reading body language and adjusting your approach when something isn't working. Mostly I know about believing that every creature has potential that just needs the right encouragement to emerge." As they talked, Biscuit remained calmly seated beside Sarah, occasionally glancing at Jack as if seeking permission to transfer his allegiance to this new teacher who spoke his language so fluently. "We practice every morning at 8, Jack found himself saying. "At my ranch, if you're serious about helping." Sarah's smile carried the warmth of someone who'd found an unexpected gift. "I'll be there tomorrow." The drive home gave Jack time to reflect on the day's mixed results. The library visit had confirmed Biscuit's natural aptitude for gentle interaction, while the farmer's market had revealed areas that needed work. But Sarah's unexpected offer of assistance felt like a turning point, the first indication that someone else believed in the possibility of what they were trying to accomplish. That evening, as Jack made notes in his ranch journal about the day's training progress, Biscuit settled beside his chair with the contented sigh of a dog who'd worked hard and felt satisfied with his efforts. The new collar and leash lay neatly coiled on the table, symbols of commitment and possibility that seemed to promise better things ahead. Outside, the Montana evening painted the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple, but inside, something was changing. The quiet house no longer felt empty but expectant, filled with the sense that important work was being done, that lives were being shaped and purposes discovered. Jack reached down to scratch behind Biscuit's ears, feeling the warm weight of partnership and shared mission. Tomorrow they would have help. Tomorrow they would take another step toward becoming something neither of them could have imagined when a dollar changed everything. Sarah arrived at the ranch the next morning carrying a worn leather portfolio that spoke of decades of dedicated service. Inside, Jack glimpsed the corner of an official document, her teaching certificate dated 1975, declaring Sarah Elizabeth Collins qualified to educate the young minds of Montana. She'd brought it, she explained, not from vanity, but as proof that she understood the importance of proper credentials and systematic preparation. 32 years in the classroom teaches you that good intentions aren't enough, she said, settling onto the porch steps beside Biscuit, who'd immediately appointed himself her devoted student. You need structure, goals, and measurable progress, plus backup plans for when things don't go according to script. Jack appreciated her practical approach. Too many well-meaning people offered help that consisted mainly of enthusiasm and good wishes. Sarah brought expertise, even if it came from working with children rather than dogs. Their first training session together revealed the natural partnership that sometimes develops between people who share similar philosophies despite different backgrounds. Sarah's teaching methods translated surprisingly well to dog training, breaking complex behaviors into manageable steps, celebrating small victories, maintaining patience when progress stalled. "Watch his ears," she instructed as Jack worked on the stay command. "See how they prick forward when he's concentrating. That's your cue to reinforce the behavior before his attention wanders." Under Sarah's guidance, Biscuit's training accelerated noticeably. Her insights about timing, motivation, and the importance of ending sessions on a positive note helped Jack refine his approach. More importantly, her presence seemed to energize Biscuit, who clearly thrived on having multiple sources of attention and encouragement. As they worked together over the following weeks, Sarah gradually revealed her own story. She'd never married, dedicating herself instead to the hundreds of children who'd passed through her classroom. Her small house in town was filled with thank you cards, graduation announcements, and photos from former students who'd stayed in touch over the years. "People assume I must be lonely," she said one morning as they practiced Biscuit's response to wheelchair users, using an old wheelchair Jack had borrowed from the medical supply store. "But I've been part of raising 3 generations of Cedar Falls children. I've watched kids who couldn't read in first grade go on to become doctors and teachers. That's a pretty full life." Still, Jack sensed something beneath her contentment, a restlessness that came from suddenly having vast amounts of time and experience with nowhere to direct them. Retirement, even from fulfilling work, could feel like a form of exile for people accustomed to being needed. Their breakthrough came during a visit to Cedar Falls Elementary, where Sarah had arranged for them to meet with the current principal, Mrs. Rodriguez. The school had been considering a therapy dog program to help students dealing with anxiety and stress, particularly around testing periods and difficult family situations. "We'd start small," Mrs. Rodriguez explained as she led them through the familiar hallways where Sarah had once worked. "Maybe one afternoon a week, working with students who might benefit from some extra emotional support." The first classroom they visited contained a group of 3rd graders who'd been prepared for their special visitor. Biscuit entered on his best behavior, walking steadily beside Jack, while 24 8-year-old eyes tracked his every movement with intense curiosity. "This is Biscuit," Jack began, his voice carrying the calm authority that had served him well in countless situations involving nervous animals and uncertain humans. "He's learning to be a therapy dog, which means his job is to help people feel better when they're sad or worried or scared." One little girl raised her hand tentatively. "Is he friendly?" "Very friendly," Jack assured her. "But he's also very gentle. He knows how to be calm when people need him to be calm." Sarah had coached Jack on the importance of establishing ground rules before any interaction between children and animals. They reviewed proper petting techniques, the importance of letting Biscuit sniff their hands first, and the need to use quiet voices and gentle movements. The magic began when a boy named Tyler, who'd been sitting apart from the group with his arms crossed and his face set in the particular expression of a child who'd learned to expect disappointment, slowly approached Biscuit. The dog seemed to sense the boy's hesitation and remained perfectly still, allowing Tyler to control the pace of their introduction. "He feels really warm," Tyler said softly, his hand resting on Biscuit's head. For the first time since they'd entered the classroom, the boy smiled. One by one, the other children took turns greeting Biscuit, each interaction revealing the dog's remarkable ability to adjust his energy level to match each child's needs. With the shy ones, he remained calm and patient. With the more energetic children, he allowed a bit more enthusiasm to show through, though he never lost the gentle composure that made him safe to be around. The session's most powerful moment came when a girl named Emma, different from the Emma at the veterinary clinic, but equally in need of comfort, began to cry softly while petting Biscuit. Her teacher later explained that Emma's parents were going through a difficult divorce, and she'd been struggling with anxiety and sadness. Without any prompting from Jack, Biscuit gently rested his chin on Emma's knee, offering the wordless comfort that only animals can provide. The girl's crying gradually subsided as she stroked his soft fur, her breathing becoming deeper and more regular. "He knows when people are sad," she said wonderingly. "Yes," Jack replied, his own voice thick with emotion at witnessing Biscuit's intuitive understanding of human need. "He does know. After the visit, as they walked back to Jack's truck, Sarah was unusually quiet. Finally, she stopped walking and turned to face him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Watching you work with those children, seeing how naturally you communicate with them, you have a gift for this. Teaching isn't just about knowledge. It's about recognizing what each individual needs and finding ways to provide it." "You're a natural teacher, Jack." The compliment caught Jack off guard. He'd always thought of himself as someone who worked well with animals, not necessarily with people. But the classroom experience had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose that felt both familiar and entirely new. Their growing partnership was interrupted the following week when Tom Mallory made his first appearance at the ranch in over 2 years. Jack heard the truck before he saw it, the distinctive rumble of the diesel engine Tom had always favored for its reliability and power. Biscuit's ears perked up at the unfamiliar sound, but he remained in his downstay position as they'd been practicing. Tom emerged from the truck, looking exactly as Jack remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of careful posture that spoke of years in military service. His hair had gone completely grey, and new lines around his eyes suggested that the intervening years hadn't been entirely kind. But his disapproval was immediately apparent in the set of his jaw and the skeptical way he surveyed the training equipment scattered around the yard. "So it's true," Tom said without preamble. "My brother's become a dog trainer, among other things," Jack replied evenly, rising from his position beside Biscuit. "What brings you out here, Tom?" "Concern, mainly. Pete Nordstrom says you're planning to take that dog into nursing homes and schools. Says you think he's some kind of miracle worker." Sarah chose that moment to arrive for their scheduled training session, her car pulling into the yard just as the tension between the brothers began to crystallize. She took in the situation with the quick assessment skills of someone who'd managed countless classroom conflicts over the years. "You must be Tom," she said pleasantly, extending her hand with the confident grace of someone comfortable with introductions. "I'm Sarah Collins. I've been helping Jack and Biscuit with their therapy dog training." Tom shook her hand politely, but his expression remained skeptical. "And you think this is a legitimate use of time and resources?" "I think," Sarah replied carefully, "that I've seen this dog comfort a crying child in ways that 32 years of teaching experience couldn't match. Sometimes the most important work looks foolish to people who haven't witnessed its effects." The teaching certificate in Sarah's portfolio represented more than professional qualification. It stood as evidence that some callings require both heart and credentials. That meaningful work often demands the patience to prove itself to skeptics who measure worth in more conventional terms. As the three adults stood in the afternoon sun with Biscuit resting calmly beside them, Jack felt the weight of his brother's disapproval and the strength of Sarah's support. The therapy dog program was no longer just an idea or even a personal project. It was becoming something that would need to prove itself to a community that wasn't entirely convinced of its value. But watching Biscuit steady, breathing and remembering Emma's smile, Jack felt certain they were on the right path. Regardless of who understood it and who didn't, the drawing arrived in Jack's mailbox on a Thursday, carefully folded inside a manila envelope addressed in a child's careful handwriting. When he unfolded it, he found himself looking at a crayon masterpiece that captured something essential about Biscuit's presence in the world. The dog was rendered in brown and black strokes, unmistakably chubby, with disproportionately large eyes that somehow conveyed exactly the gentle wisdom that made him so effective at his work. Above the drawing, in purple crayon, Emma had written, "Thank you, Biscuit," with a heart dotting the I in his name. Jack found himself staring at the simple artwork longer than seemed reasonable for a grown man. But the drawing represented something profound, tangible proof that their visits were making a difference, that what they were doing mattered enough for a child to spend her free time creating this gift. 3 months had passed since their first tentative visit to the elementary school. What had begun as an experimental afternoon had evolved into a regular schedule. Tuesdays at Sunset Manor Nursing Home, Thursdays at the elementary school. and occasional special visits to the county hospital when Dr. Chen thought certain patients might benefit from Biscuit's calm presence. The routine had transformed not just Biscuit, who'd lost 12 pounds and gained confidence in equal measure, but Jack as well. For the first time since Martha's death, he woke each morning with purpose that extended beyond maintaining his solitary existence. People were depending on him, vulnerable people who looked forward to their visits with an anticipation that both humbled and energized him. At Sunset Manor, Biscuit had become something of a celebrity. Mrs. Henderson, the widow of the man they'd met at the library, always saved her best stories for Biscuit's visits. She'd grown up on a ranch outside Billings and would spend entire afternoons sharing memories of her childhood. Dogs, while Biscuit rested his head on her wheelchairs, armrest with infinite patience. He listens better than most people, she'd told Jack repeatedly. Doesn't interrupt, doesn't try to top your stories with his own. Just listens. The elementary school visits had proven equally rewarding, though in different ways. Children responded to Biscuit with an enthusiasm that required careful management, but his presence seemed to create a buffer zone of calm in environments that could be overwhelming for anxious young minds. Teachers reported that students looked forward to Biscuit days with anticipation that improved their overall classroom behavior. But success had also brought scrutiny. Not everyone in Cedar Falls appreciated the attention Jack's therapy dog program was receiving. The local newspaper had run a feature story that attracted interest from surrounding communities, leading to requests for visits that Jack wasn't sure they were ready to handle. Some longtime residents grumbled about resources being devoted to what they saw as elaborate pet therapy when the county faced more pressing needs. The criticism stung, but it was Tom's continued disapproval that caused Jack the most pain. His brother had made no attempt to disguise his feelings about what he clearly considered a frivolous pursuit unworthy of serious attention. Their interactions, rare as they were, had become exercises in careful politeness that avoided the subject of Biscuit and everything associated with him. Sarah, observant as always, noticed Jack's growing tension about his brother's attitude. They were walking Biscuit through the town park after a successful school visit when she finally addressed it directly. "You want to talk about what happened between you and Tom?" she asked, settling onto a bench, while Biscuit investigated the fascinating scents around a nearby oak tree. Jack sat beside her, considering how much to reveal. Sarah had become a trusted friend, but the story of his estrangement from Tom touched on family dynamics that had been complicated since childhood. "It goes back a long way," he said finally. Tom always thought he was the responsible one, the one Dad could count on to keep the family legacy intact. When Dad started having heart problems in the late 80s, Tom wanted to modernize the operation, take on debt to expand and compete with the bigger outfits. "And you disagreed?" "I thought we should stay small, focus on quality rather than quantity." Dad was torn. He loved the idea of expansion but worried about the risks. In the end, he left the decision to us boys to figure out after he was gone. Jack paused, watching Biscuit's methodical exploration of the park. The memory still carried weight, even after all these years. When Dad died in '92, Tom was ready to move forward with his expansion plans. But I had concerns about market conditions, about taking on that much debt when cattle prices were unstable. We argued for months. Finally, Tom said, if I wasn't willing to think big, maybe I wasn't the right partner for the operation. What did you do? I bought him out, used money Martha inherited from her grandmother to give Tom his share of the ranch value. He moved to Billings, started his own operation with that money as capital. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the information. And he succeeded? More than succeeded. Built one of the most profitable cattle operations in the state. Proved that his vision was right and mine was limited. But you kept the family ranch going for another 20 years. Small scale. Never the operation it could have been under Tom's leadership. Jack's voice carried the weight of decisions that had shaped two lives in fundamentally different directions. When cattle prices crashed in 2010, I had to sell most of the herd to stay afloat. Tom could have weathered that storm easily. Sarah reached over and placed her hand on Jack's arm, a gesture of comfort that reminded him of Martha's ability to provide perspective during difficult moments. Jack, from what I can see, you've lived a good life. You and Martha were happy. You maintained something beautiful here. You've been part of this community for decades. Different doesn't mean wrong. Tell that to Tom. Every time he looks at me, I can see him thinking about what the ranch could have been, what I should have accomplished. Maybe, Sarah said gently, Tom is dealing with his own regrets. Success isn't the same thing as satisfaction. Building a big operation means sacrifices, time, relationships, the kind of life you and Martha had together. Biscuit chose that moment to return from his exploration, settling at Jack's feet with the contented sigh of a dog who'd completed his assigned duties. The drawing in Jack's pocket crinkled as he shifted position, reminding him of the child who'd taken time to create something beautiful in appreciation for what they were doing. You know what I think? Sarah continued. I think Tom sees how much joy this therapy work brings you, how it's given you purpose and reconnected you with the community. Maybe his disapproval isn't about the program itself, but about feeling left out of something meaningful. The idea hadn't occurred to Jack before, but it resonated with memories of his brother's personality, driven, successful, but perhaps struggling to find meaning beyond business achievement. What are you suggesting? Invite him to come along on a visit. Let him see what you're actually doing instead of just hearing about it secondhand. Sometimes people resist things they don't understand. Jack considered the suggestion while Biscuit dozed in the afternoon sun. The idea of exposing their carefully developed program to Tom's critical scrutiny felt risky. But perhaps Sarah was right. Perhaps his brother's opposition came from ignorance rather than malice. That evening, as Jack filed Emma's drawing in the folder where he kept all the thank you notes and positive feedback from their visits, he thought about bridges that needed building and relationships that deserved another chance. The artwork, simple as it was, represented something precious, recognition that their work mattered, that lives were being touched in positive ways. Maybe it was time to help Tom understand that success could be measured in more ways than he'd previously considered. Maybe it was time to show his brother that some achievements, while impossible to quantify in traditional terms, created value that endured long after profit margins were forgotten. The drawing would stay in its place of honor, a reminder that the smallest gestures often carried the greatest meaning, and that sometimes the most important work in the world looked like nothing more than an old man and his dog spending time with people who needed them. The Medal of Honor sat in a place of honor above Tom's fireplace, its bronze star and ribbon faded but dignified, representing service in Iraq that had shaped the trajectory of his life in ways their family was still discovering. Jack stood in his brother's living room for the first time in 5 years, holding his hat in his hands and struggling to find words that might bridge the gap between them. Tom's house reflected his personality, organized, efficient, impressive without being ostentatious. The furniture was solid and practical, the kind that would last generations without requiring replacement. Military photographs lined one wall, showing Tom in dress uniform, receiving various commendations, leading training exercises, standing with fellow officers, whose faces carried the particular gravity that came from shared experience in dangerous places. "I appreciate you coming by," Tom said, though his tone suggested obligation rather than enthusiasm. "Coffee?" "That'd be fine." Jack followed his brother to the kitchen, noting the precision with which everything was arranged. Even the coffee mugs hung from hooks in perfect alignment, each one positioned exactly 2 inches from its neighbor. They made small talk while the coffee brewed. Weather, cattle prices, news from mutual acquaintances, carefully avoiding the subject that had brought Jack there. Finally, as they settled at the kitchen table with their cups, Jack gathered his courage to address the real purpose of his visit. "I was hoping you might consider coming along on one of our therapy visits," he said. See what we're actually doing instead of just hearing about it from other people." Tom's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle stiffening that suggested defensive walls going up. "Jack, I've told you how I feel about this whole thing. You're a grown man, and if you want to spend your time playing with a dog, that's your choice. But don't expect me to pretend it's something more than it is. What if it is something more? What if you saw it for yourself before making up your mind?" "I've seen enough." Tom's voice carried the clipped authority that had served him well in military command. "You're dealing with grief, and I understand that. Martha's death hit you hard, but turning a pet into some kind of mission isn't the answer." The words stung, partly because they echoed Jack's own occasional doubts. There were moments when he wondered if his commitment to the therapy program was indeed an elaborate form of grief management rather than genuine service to others. "Is that really what you think? That this is just about Martha?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he hadn't fully articulated. "I think you've always been too soft for your own good. Dad knew it, I knew it. Probably Martha knew it too, though she loved you for it. You see a stray dog, and you think you can save the world." The criticism cut deep because it contained just enough truth to be painful. Jack had always been the brother who brought home injured animals, who gave second chances to ranch hands that other operations had given up on, who believed in redemption, even when evidence suggested otherwise. But before he could respond, Tom's expression softened slightly. "Look, I know you mean well, but the world's full of real problems that need real solutions. Veterans who can't get proper medical care, schools that don't have enough funding, infrastructure that's falling apart. Playing dress-up with a pet dog doesn't fix any of that." Jack left his brother's house, feeling defeated and more isolated than before. The conversation had accomplished nothing except to confirm the distance between them, to reinforce Tom's conviction that his younger brother was wasting time on frivolous pursuits while serious people tackled serious problems. But the next day brought an opportunity that would challenge everyone's assumptions about the value of therapy dog work. Captain Rodriguez from the county sheriff's department called to ask if Jack and Biscuit might consider visiting the prison, not the main facility, but the minimum security annex where inmates nearing release participated in rehabilitation programs. "We've got a group of men working on anger management and substance abuse recovery," Captain Rodriguez explained. "The counselor thinks animal interaction might help with emotional regulation. Some of these guys haven't had positive contact with anything living in years. The prison visit required additional certification and training, but Dr. Chen helped expedite the process." 3 weeks later, Jack found himself walking through multiple security checkpoints with Biscuit at his side, both of them subjected to thorough inspections before being escorted to a common room where 8 men waited with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. The inmates were a diverse group, young and old, various ethnicities and backgrounds, unified only by their shared experience of incarceration and their participation in the rehabilitation program. Most sat with arms crossed, maintaining the careful emotional distance that prison life demanded. "This is Biscuit," Jack began, using the calm, non-threatening tone he'd developed for introducing the therapy program. "He's here because sometimes it's easier to talk about difficult things when there's a friendly animal around to help you feel calmer." One man, Miguel according to his name tag, snorted softly. "Man, I ain't talked to nobody but guards and counselors for 18 months. What's a dog gonna do that they couldn't?" "Maybe nothing," Jack admitted. "But maybe something you don't expect." The session began awkwardly, with most men maintaining their defensive postures while Biscuit settled in the center of the room, demonstrating his usual patience with new environments. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to shift. It started when Carlos, a quiet man in his 40s, tentatively reached out to pet Biscuit's head. The dog's response was immediate and gentle, a soft tail wag, a slight lean into the touch that communicated acceptance without demands. "He's real calm," Carlos observed. "Not jumpy like most dogs." That's part of his training, Jack explained. He's learned to read people's moods and adjust his energy accordingly. Miguel, who'd been watching from across the room, slowly moved closer. What's his story? He always lived good, or did he come from somewhere bad? Jack sensed an opportunity for connection. He came from the animal shelter. Nobody wanted him because he was overweight and not much to look at. Got passed over dozens of times before I found him. So he knows about being thrown away, Miguel said quietly. His hand joining Carlos's in petting Biscuit's soft fur. He knows about second chances. Jack corrected gently. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Jack had experienced in his months of therapy work. These men, isolated from family and community, began sharing stories about pets they'd had as children, about animals that had provided comfort during difficult times, about the guilt they carried for abandoning responsibilities to creatures who'd depended on them. Miguel, it turned out, had been a dog owner before his addiction led to imprisonment. Had this pit bull named Zeus, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Best dog I ever knew. Had to give him up when I got arrested. Wonder if he remembers me, you know? Wonder if he thinks I just didn't want him anymore. Biscuit seemed to sense the man's pain, moving closer until his warm weight pressed against Miguel's leg. The contact appeared to unlock something in the inmate, who began talking about his daughter, about mistakes that had cost him years of her childhood, about letters he'd written but never sent because he was afraid she'd inherited his belief that he was beyond redemption. Dogs don't hold grudges, Jack said softly. They live in the present. Zeus probably remembers the good times, not the abandonment, you think. I know dogs forgive faster than people do. Sometimes they help us remember how to forgive ourselves. As the session continued, Jack watched these hardened men reveal vulnerability he suspected they'd kept hidden for years. Biscuit moved from person to person with his usual intuitive understanding, offering exactly the kind of non-judgmental presence that allowed people to lower their emotional defenses. When the visit ended, Miguel approached Jack privately. That dog of yours, he's doing something important here. Don't let nobody tell you different. Driving home, Jack thought about Tom's dismissive words, about real problems and real solutions. Maybe therapy dog work couldn't fix veteran health care or educational funding. But watching Miguel's face as he connected with Biscuit, seeing grown men allow themselves to be vulnerable in ways that traditional counseling hadn't achieved, that seemed pretty real too. That evening, Jack called Tom, even though he knew his brother would likely be uninterested in hearing about the prison visit. How'd it go? Tom asked, surprising Jack with the question. Better than I expected. These men, they've been carrying around guilt and pain for years. Biscuit helped them talk about it in ways they hadn't been able to before. Tom was quiet for a moment. That's good, I guess. If it helps. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it wasn't dismissal either. For the first time, Jack detected a crack in his brother's armor of skepticism. A tiny opening that might eventually allow for understanding, maybe healing family wounds. Like all worthwhile endeavors, simply required patience and the willingness to keep trying. Even when progress seemed impossible to measure. The call came at 3:47 in the morning, jarring Jack from sleep with the particular urgency that accompanies middle-of-the-night phone rings. Dr. Chen's voice was calm but serious, his words cutting through Jack's grogginess like cold water. Jack, I'm at the hospital with your brother. He's had a heart attack, a significant one. You should come. The drive to Billings took 45 minutes that felt like hours, Jack's hands gripping the steering wheel while his mind raced through decades of unresolved tension and unspoken affection. Biscuit sat quietly in the passenger seat, somehow sensing the gravity of the situation through the subtle changes in Jack's breathing and body language. The cardiac intensive care unit smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. Its hallways populated by people moving with the particular combination of urgency and reverence that medical emergencies demanded. Tom lay connected to monitors and IVs, his normally commanding presence diminished by hospital gowns and the vulnerability of serious illness. Dr. Sarah Kim, the attending cardiologist, explained the situation with professional compassion. Massive myocardial infarction. We were able to open the blocked artery, but there's been damage. The next 72 hours will be critical. Jack settled into the uncomfortable bedside chair that would become his second home, watching the rhythmic peaks and valleys of his brother's heartbeat displayed on electronic monitors. Tom's face, pale and drawn, looked older than his 63 years, marked by lines of pain and medication-induced sleep. The hospital bracelet around Tom's wrist, white plastic with black lettering spelling out Thomas Mallory, along with his birth date and medical record number, seemed like such an inadequate identifier for a man who'd led soldiers through combat zones and built a cattle empire from borrowed money and stubborn determination. On the second day, as Tom drifted in and out of consciousness, Jack made a decision that violated every hospital policy he'd been informed about. He smuggled Biscuit into the ICU, tucked inside a large duffel bag with air holes carefully cut into the fabric. The dog's presence was a calculated risk, but Jack felt instinctively that his brother needed something the hospital couldn't provide, the kind of wordless comfort that only animals could offer. Biscuit emerged from the bag with his usual calm assessment of new environments, immediately understanding that this situation called for his gentlest behavior. He settled on the floor beside Tom's bed, his presence creating an invisible buffer of peace in the sterile, anxiety-filled room. The nursing staff discovered them during the evening shift change. Instead of the confrontation Jack expected, Nurse Patricia Gonzalez, a veteran of 30 years in cardiac care, took one look at Biscuit's serene demeanor and her patient's slightly improved vital signs and made an administrative decision. "I don't see any dogs," she announced to her colleagues, "but I do notice that Mr. Mallory's heart rate has stabilized for the first time since admission." As the hours passed, Biscuit's presence in the ICU created ripple effects that no one had anticipated. Other patients, glimpsing the therapy dog through their doorways, seemed to find comfort in his calm presence. Family members stressed by their loved ones' conditions would pause to pet his soft fur, drawing momentary relief from their vigils of worry. On the third day, Tom's eyes focused with true awareness for the first time since the attack. His gaze fell immediately on Biscuit, who was lying quietly beside the bed, with his head resting on his paws. "How?" Tom's voice was barely a whisper, his throat raw from intubation. "Don't try to talk too much," Jack said, leaning forward. "You had a heart attack, pretty serious one. But you're going to be okay." Tom's eyes moved between Jack and Biscuit, confusion giving way to something that might have been amusement. "You brought the dog to the hospital? Seemed like you might need him more than I did." For the first time in years, Tom's expression softened completely. The walls of skepticism and professional distance that had characterized their recent interactions simply melted away, replaced by the vulnerability of someone who'd faced his own mortality and found it wanting. "Jack," Tom said, his voice gaining strength, "there's things I need to tell you, things I should have said years ago, over the next several days." As Tom's condition stabilized and Biscuit maintained his unofficial residence in the cardiac unit, the brothers had conversations that decades of family gatherings had somehow never facilitated. With the leveling effect of serious illness removing pretense and urgency, they were finally able to address the wounds that had divided them. "I need you to know," Tom said during one of their evening talks, "that buying you out of the ranch wasn't about money or business strategy. It was about fear." Jack waited, recognizing the difficulty his brother was having with vulnerability that didn't come naturally to someone accustomed to command and control. Dad always talked about the ranch like it was sacred ground, something that had to be preserved and protected at all costs. When he died and left us to figure it out together, I was terrified we'd lose it through indecision or compromise. I thought if one person was in charge, if there was clear leadership and vision, we could build something that would last forever. "You were probably right," Jack said quietly. "No, I wasn't. I was arrogant and scared, and I convinced myself that my way was the only way. What I really feared was that your approach, patient, thoughtful, focused on relationships rather than results, would make me look inadequate by comparison. The admission hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of misunderstandings that had shaped both their lives in profound ways. You always had something I couldn't figure out, Tom continued, his hand moving to rest on Biscuit's head as the dog had positioned himself within reach. Animals trusted you instantly. People opened up to you in ways they never did with me. I spent my whole military career learning how to lead through authority and discipline, but you could accomplish more with a gentle word and infinite patience. Jack felt tears threatening as decades of self-doubt began to dissolve. Tom, you built something amazing. Everything you accomplished, everything I accomplished, was just building. You've been healing. There's a difference. As if to underscore the point, Biscuit chose that moment to demonstrate exactly what Tom meant. An elderly woman shuffled past the doorway, pausing when she spotted the therapy dog. Her face, etched with the exhaustion of someone maintaining a bedside vigil, brightened noticeably. "Is he friendly?" she asked. The same question Jack had heard hundreds of times in dozens of different settings. "Very," Jack assured her. And Biscuit rose to greet this new person who clearly needed his particular brand of comfort. The woman knelt beside Biscuit with visible effort, her hands trembling as she petted his soft fur. "My husband's been here 3 weeks, she whispered. "Stroke, the doctors say. Well, they say I should prepare myself. But this little guy, he reminds me that there's still sweetness in the world, even when everything seems dark." After she continued down the hallway, Tom was quiet for a long time. Finally, he turned to Jack with an expression of wonder and regret. "How long has it been since I did something that mattered like that? Something that brought comfort to a stranger for no other reason than kindness?" "It's not too late," Jack said. "Nothing's ever too late if you're willing to start where you are." Tom's recovery proceeded steadily, aided by medical expertise and the intangible benefits of Biscuit's presence. The therapy dog had somehow become an unofficial mascot of the cardiac unit, his visits scheduled around medical procedures and visiting hours with the tacit approval of staff who'd witnessed his positive effects on patients and families. Dr. Kim, initially skeptical of non-traditional therapeutic interventions, found herself documenting the correlation between Biscuit's presence and improved patient outcomes. "There's something to be said for treatments that address emotional distress alongside physical symptoms," she admitted to Jack. "Your dog is providing something we can't prescribe." As Tom prepared for discharge, the hospital bracelet that had initially seemed like such an inadequate identification had become a symbol of transformation. The man leaving the hospital was fundamentally different from the one who'd arrived in the emergency room, not just physically healed, but emotionally opened in ways that years of success and achievement had somehow prevented. "I want to help," Tom said as they gathered his belongings on discharge day. "With the therapy program, I mean. If you'll have me." Jack looked at his brother, pale but determined, humbled but not broken, and felt decades of distance finally beginning to close. "Biscuit could use another handler," he said, "especially one who understands the value of second chances." The plastic hospital bracelet went into Tom's wallet, not as a memento of illness, but as a reminder of the day vulnerability had finally allowed healing to begin. The permit arrived on a Friday afternoon, stamped and signed with the official authority that transformed an ambitious idea into legal reality. "Community Center Special Event Permit," the document declared in formal typeface. "For the first annual Healing Paws Community Celebration." Jack held the paper in his hands with the same mixture of excitement and trepidation he'd felt years ago when he'd first signed the mortgage papers for the ranch. What had begun as a conversation between Jack, Sarah, and Tom about expanding their therapy program had somehow evolved into a full-scale community event. The Cedar Falls Community Center had donated their facility for an entire Saturday. Local businesses had offered sponsorships, and word was spreading through neighboring towns about the demonstration of therapy dog work that would serve as the event's centerpiece. Tom, 3 weeks out of the hospital and moving with the careful deliberation of someone still recovering from major cardiac surgery, had thrown himself into the planning with the organizational skills that had made his cattle operation so successful. His kitchen table was covered with charts, schedules, and contact lists that reflected his military precision approach to logistics. We've got confirmation from 12 nursing homes, 8 schools, the county hospital, and 3 veterans organizations, Tom reported during one of their planning sessions. Plus, the prison rehabilitation program wants to send a representative. That's potentially 300 people who've been directly impacted by therapy dog work. Sarah, reviewing her own lists with the methodical thoroughness that had served her well through 3 decades of teaching, looked up with concern. That's wonderful, but are we sure Biscuit can handle that level of activity? He's been working harder than usual lately, and I've noticed he seems more tired after our regular visits. Jack had noticed it too. A subtle change in Biscuit's energy level that worried him more than he wanted to admit. The dog was still performing beautifully during their scheduled visits, still demonstrating the same intuitive understanding of human emotional needs that made him so effective. But there were signs of stress, more frequent napping, occasional reluctance to engage with new people, a quality of patience that seemed effortful rather than natural. Maybe we're pushing too hard, Jack admitted. Maybe this event is too much too soon. Or maybe, Tom suggested, with the gentle pragmatism that had replaced his earlier skepticism, we need to trust that Biscuit will tell us what he can and can't handle. Animals are honest about their limitations in ways people often aren't. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of mail that included an envelope from the county correctional facility. Inside, Jack found a letter addressed in the careful handwriting he'd come to recognize as Miguel's, the inmate who'd been so moved by their therapy sessions. Mr. Mallory, the letter began, I hope this finds you and Biscuit well. I wanted to write because I have a request that means more to me than I can probably explain properly. My daughter Sophia is turning 12 next month. I haven't seen her since she was 8, since I got arrested and lost the right to be part of her life. Her mother agreed to let me write to Sophia, and I've been telling her about the therapy dog visits, about how Biscuit helps people talk about difficult feelings. Sophia wrote back that she would like to meet him someday, that maybe he could help her understand why her dad had to go away and whether it's safe to hope that people can really change. I know this is asking a lot, and I understand if it's not possible, but if Biscuit could visit Sophia, not for me but for her, it might help heal something that my mistakes broke. She lives with her grandmother in Cedar Falls now, Mrs. Rosa Delgado, on Elm Street. I thought maybe, if you were planning any special events, it might be a chance for her to see what therapy work is really about. Jack read the letter twice, feeling the weight of a father's love transmitted through carefully chosen words. Miguel's request touched on something fundamental about the therapy program, its ability to create connections that transcended the boundaries society typically maintained between different populations. We have to make this happen, Jack said, showing the letter to Tom and Sarah. This little girl needs to understand that her father is working toward redemption, that people can change and heal. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she read Miguel's words. Of course we do. But Jack, this is exactly what I mean about taking on too much. You're trying to heal everyone's pain, solve everyone's problems. Even Biscuit can't carry that kind of emotional weight indefinitely. Her concern was valid, but it also revealed something Jack hadn't fully recognized before, Sarah's own struggle with the expanding scope of their mission. She'd been working as hard as anyone to make the community event successful, but her energy seemed more limited lately, her usual enthusiasm tempered by what looked like physical fatigue. Sarah, are you feeling all right? You seem tired lately. She paused before answering, her expression carrying the weight of information she'd been reluctant to share. I had some tests done last month. The results were concerning, nothing immediately life-threatening. But I need to start treatment that will probably affect my energy levels. The admission settled over the room like a shadow, forcing all three of them to confront the reality that their partnership, so recently formed and already so productive, might be more fragile than they'd assumed. "What kind of treatment?" Tom asked gently. "Chemotherapy." The oncologist is optimistic, but it means I won't be able to maintain my current level of involvement with the program. At least not for a while. Jack felt the familiar grip of loss tightening around his chest. First Martha, now Sarah, the people who'd helped him discover purpose and meaning, seemed destined to be taken away just when he needed them most. But Tom surprised him by leaning forward with the practical focus that had served him well through military leadership. "Okay, then we adjust our approach. Sarah, what can you realistically handle over the next few months? Jack, what's the minimum viable version of this event that still accomplishes our goals? And let's figure out how to address Miguel's request without overwhelming Biscuit." The planning session that followed was unlike any they'd previously conducted. Instead of expanding their ambitions, they focused on sustainability and realistic expectations. The community event would proceed, but with careful attention to Biscuit's limits and Sarah's health constraints. They arranged for Sofia Delgado to attend the event as a special guest, with Miguel participating via video call from the prison. Other therapy dogs from surrounding areas would be invited to share the workload, demonstrating that the healing power they'd discovered with Biscuit could be replicated and expanded. The goal isn't to prove that our program is perfect, Jack realized as they refined their plans. It's to show that this kind of work is possible, that communities can support healing in ways that go beyond traditional medical and social services. As the event date approached, Jack found himself spending more quiet time with Biscuit, watching for signs of stress or overwork. The dog seemed to sense the increased attention, responding with the same gentle patience that had made him so effective in his therapy role. But there were moments, a longer pause before responding to commands, a more deliberate pace during their walks, that reminded Jack of the responsibility he carried for this animal's well-being. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of gold and purple, Jack spoke aloud the fears he'd been carrying. "I'm scared we're asking too much of you, boy. All these people depending on you, expecting you to solve problems that are bigger than any dog should have to handle." Biscuit shifted position until his head rested on Jack's leg, his brown eyes reflecting the same steady calm that had characterized their partnership from the beginning. In that moment, Jack understood something fundamental about their relationship. It wasn't about pushing boundaries or proving points, but about being present for whatever healing was possible. One interaction at a time. The community center permit on his kitchen table represented more than official authorization for an event. It symbolized trust, the community's faith in what they were trying to accomplish. Miguel's hope for his daughter's healing, Sarah's continued commitment despite her illness, Tom's hard-won belief in the value of their work. 3 days before the event, Dr. Chen performed a complete examination of Biscuit, pronouncing him healthy, but noting the subtle signs of increased stress that Jack had observed. "He's handling the workload well," the veterinarian concluded, "but I'd recommend scaling back his schedule after this event. Even therapy dogs need rest and recovery time." The recommendation confirmed what Jack had already suspected. They would need to find ways to expand their impact without expanding Biscuit's individual workload. The community event wouldn't be an ending but a beginning, a demonstration that would hopefully inspire others to develop their own therapy programs. As Jack filed the permit in his growing collection of program documents, he felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and responsibility that had characterized every major decision in his life. Tomorrow, they would trust in the healing power that had brought them this far, believing that sometimes the most important work happened, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of kindness multiplied, across a community willing to embrace the possibility of hope. The Handwritten letter arrived that morning, delivered by Rosa Delgado herself, just as Jack was loading Biscuit into the truck for the community event. Miguel's daughter had written to her father the night before, her 12-year-old words carrying the weight of years of confused anger and cautious hope. "Dear Papa," the letter began in careful cursive. "Abuela says I should meet the dog you wrote about. She says maybe he can help me understand things better. I'm scared to see you on the video call because I don't know what to say. But I want to try because you sound different in your letters now. Like maybe you remember how to be my papa again. Rosa Delgado, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and eyes that reflected a lifetime of caring for others," handed Jack the letter with trembling hands. "She's been carrying so much pain, Mr. Mallory. Her father's mistakes stole her childhood in many ways. If your dog can help her find some peace." Jack folded the letter carefully, feeling the responsibility of a child's fragile trust. "We'll do everything we can. Mrs. Delgado, Biscuit has a gift for helping people say things they can't find words for." The Cedar Falls Community Center was already bustling with activity when they arrived. Cars filled the parking lot and lined the adjacent streets, representing a turnout that exceeded even Tom's optimistic projections. Families, elderly couples, teenagers, and young children streamed through the entrance, drawn by curiosity about the therapy dog program that had become a source of community pride. Inside, the main hall had been transformed into demonstration areas where Biscuit and 3 other certified therapy dogs would showcase their work. Representatives from nursing homes, schools, and hospitals had set up information booths, sharing stories about the positive impact of animal-assisted therapy. Local media representatives moved through the crowd, documenting what they'd learned was an innovative rural approach to community mental health support. Pete Nordstrom, the feed store owner who'd initially mocked Jack's dollar investment, approached with an expression of genuine admiration. "Jack, I owe you an apology. I saw Mrs. Patterson working with one of the therapy dogs at the library last week, helping a group of kids who were struggling with reading anxiety. That little girl who could barely whisper her own name was reading aloud by the end of the session." Similar acknowledgements came throughout the morning as community members shared their own observations of the therapy program's impact. Bill Travers talked about his grandson's improved behavior after Biscuit's school visits. Dr. Chen presented data showing reduced anxiety levels among his veterinary patients who'd participated in therapy sessions, but the day's most significant moment came when Rosa Delgado arrived with Sophia, a beautiful 12-year-old girl whose cautious expression reflected her uncertain feelings about the day's planned reunion with her father. Jack knelt beside Biscuit, introducing him to Sophia with the same gentle patience he'd learned to use with all children facing difficult emotions. "Biscuit is very good at helping people feel calm when they need to talk about hard things," he explained. "Your father has been working with him to learn how to be honest about his mistakes and his love for you." Sophia petted Biscuit hesitantly, her touch becoming more confident as the dog's calm presence worked its familiar magic. "He feels warm," she observed, echoing words Jack had heard from countless other children who'd found comfort in simple contact with unconditional acceptance. The video call connection was established in a quiet side room, away from the main event's activity. Miguel appeared on screen wearing the orange uniform of the correctional facility, his face reflecting nervous hope as he saw his daughter for the first time in 4 years. "Sophia," he said, his voice barely steady, "you've grown so much. You're even more beautiful than I remembered." The girl stared at the screen with conflicted emotions playing across her young face. Biscuit, sensing her distress, moved closer until his warm weight pressed against her leg, providing the physical comfort that might make emotional vulnerability possible. "Why did you leave me, Papa?" Sophia asked, her voice small but determined. "Why did the drugs matter more than I did?" Jack watched Miguel's face crumple with the pain of a father confronting the full extent of his failures. "They didn't matter more, Mija. Nothing matters more than you. I was sick, and I made terrible choices because I didn't know how to ask for help. But being here, working with Biscuit and Mr. Mallory, I've learned that people can change when they have reasons to hope. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Biscuit providing silent support as father and daughter began the difficult process of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by addiction and incarceration. Jack facilitated when needed, but mostly allowed the healing power of honest communication to work its slow magic. When the call ended, Sophia buried her face in Biscuit's fur, her shoulders shaking with tears that seemed to release years of suppressed grief and confusion. "He really is different," she whispered to Jack. "He sounds like my papa again, not like the stranger who lived in our house before." Meanwhile, in the main hall, Tom had taken the microphone to address the assembled crowd. His words carried the authority of someone who'd learned to recognize value in unexpected places. "6 months ago, I thought my brother had lost his mind," Tom began, his voice carrying clearly through the PA system. A dollar dog, therapy visits, healing through animal companionship, it all seemed like wishful thinking. But watching Jack work with people who are hurting, seeing how a neglected mutt became a source of hope for our entire community, I've learned something about the difference between building things and healing people. He paused, his eyes finding Jack in the crowd. "My brother Jack has always understood something I had to learn the hard way, that the most important work in the world often looks like the simplest gestures. Today, we celebrate not just a therapy dog program, but a reminder that communities can heal themselves when they're willing to believe in second chances." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, reflecting the community's recognition that something special had emerged from the most unlikely beginnings. Jack felt the weight of their collective approval and support, understanding that the dollar he'd spent on an unwanted dog had purchased something far more valuable than he'd ever imagined: the chance to matter again, to contribute to healing in a world that desperately needed it. As the event continued around them, Sophia remained close to Biscuit, her hand resting on his head while she processed the complex emotions of reconnecting with her father. In that simple contact between a hurting child and a patient dog, the entire purpose of their work was perfectly illustrated. Healing happened not through grand gestures, but through small acts of love offered without conditions or expectations of return. Its framed dollar bill sat on the registration table, its worn green surface bearing the careful inscription, "Biscuit's first investment," in Jack's steady handwriting. Pete Nordstrom had insisted on displaying it as a reminder of how extraordinary journeys often begin with the simplest decisions. Visitors paused to read the accompanying note. Sometimes the smallest investments yield the greatest returns. The afternoon session was reaching its crescendo when Jack noticed Sarah moving more slowly than usual, her face pale despite the excitement surrounding them. She'd been managing information tables and coordinating volunteer schedules with her usual efficiency. But something in her posture suggested that determination was overpowering physical limitations. "Sarah," Jack approached her with concern, "maybe you should take a break. You've been going non-stop since this morning." She waved off his worry with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Jack, just tired. This is too important to miss. I want to see every moment of what we've accomplished." But as she spoke, her hand gripped the edge of the table for support, and Jack saw something in her expression that spoke of more than simple fatigue. Before he could respond, Sarah's knees buckled, and she began to sink toward the floor, with the sudden collapse that comes when the body simply refuses to continue. Tom reached her first, his military training automatically engaging as he eased her descent and checked her vital signs. Sarah, can you hear me?" Dr. Chen materialized from the crowd, kneeling beside them with the calm urgency of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. "Let's get her to the side room," he instructed, and several volunteers immediately cleared a path. As they moved Sarah to a quieter space, away from the main event, Biscuit appeared at Jack's side, his intuitive understanding of crisis situations once again demonstrating the depth of his therapeutic instincts. Without prompting, he positioned himself near Sarah's prone form, his calm presence creating a circle of peace in the midst of sudden chaos. "Her pulse is weak but steady," Dr. Chen reported after a quick examination. "Blood pressure is low. This looks like a reaction to treatment rather than an immediate emergency. But we should get her to the hospital for evaluation." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, focusing first on Biscuit's gentle face before taking in the concerned expressions surrounding her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want to spoil the day." "You haven't spoiled anything," Jack assured her, kneeling beside Biscuit. "But you need medical attention." "The event." Sarah tried to sit up, her ingrained sense of responsibility overriding her physical limitations. "The event will continue," Tom said firmly. "Jack and I can handle whatever needs to be done. Your only job right now is to let people take care of you." As the ambulance arrived and paramedics took over Sarah's care, Jack felt the familiar weight of impending loss. But this time, something different happened. Instead of withdrawing into grief and isolation, the community that had gathered to celebrate their therapy program rallied around the crisis with immediate, practical support. Mrs. Rodriguez from the elementary school took over Sarah's coordination duties without being asked. Pete Nordstrom organized a group of volunteers to manage the information tables. Rosa Delgado, still present with Sophia, began helping visitors understand the various therapy dog demonstrations. Jack watched this spontaneous organization with wonder, realizing that the healing they'd been trying to facilitate had somehow taken root in the community itself. People were caring for each other with the same instinctive kindness that Biscuit had been demonstrating all along. "She's going to be okay," Dr. Chen reported after consulting with the paramedics. This episode was likely related to her chemotherapy schedule. With proper rest and hydration, she should recover fully. "But Jack," he paused, his expression gentle but serious. "This is probably going to happen again. Sarah's treatment is aggressive, and her body is working very hard to heal." The news settled over Jack like a familiar shadow, but this time he wasn't facing it alone. Tom placed a steady hand on his shoulder, offering the kind of support that had been missing from their relationship for too many years. "We'll figure it out," Tom said simply. "Sarah believed in this program enough to push herself beyond her limits. The least we can do is make sure her work continues." As the afternoon concluded and the last visitors departed, Jack found himself alone in the community center with Biscuit and the framed dollar bill that had started everything. The dog settled beside him with the contented sigh of an animal who'd completed important work. While Jack reflected on the day's mixed emotions of triumph and concern, the dollar bill, once just legal tender exchanged for an unwanted dog, had become something approaching sacred, a symbol of how small acts of faith could generate consequences far beyond their original scope. But looking at it now, Jack understood that the bill itself wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the decision it represented, the choice to see potential where others saw only problems, to invest hope where logic suggested caution. The overwhelming response to their community event had validated not just the therapy dog program, but something deeper, the human capacity for healing when given appropriate tools and support. Jack had watched strangers comfort each other, seen former skeptics become advocates, witnessed a fractured family begin the slow work of reconnection. Biscuit's gentle breathing beside him provided a rhythm of contentment that seemed to encompass all they'd accomplished and all they still hoped to achieve. The dog's presence had catalyzed healing that extended far beyond individual therapy sessions to touch an entire community's understanding of compassion and connection. As Jack carefully returned the framed dollar to its case, he realized that his mission had never really been about training a therapy dog or proving skeptics wrong. It had been about rediscovering the fundamental truth that healing happens through relationship, between people and animals, between family members, between communities willing to support each other through whatever challenges arise. Tomorrow would bring new concerns about Sarah's health and new questions about the program's future. But tonight, Jack felt certain that what they'd started would continue to grow and spread, carried forward by the dozens of people who'd witnessed the power of simple kindness to transform lives in ways that couldn't be measured but could definitely be felt. The official certification hung framed in the ranch house kitchen, its gold seal and formal language declaring Biscuit a registered therapy animal. Level 3, Advanced Community Support. Below it, a smaller frame held Sarah's final note, written just days before her peaceful passing. Healing multiplies when it's shared. Thank you for showing me that teaching never really ends. 6 months had transformed the Mallory Ranch from a quiet retirement into a training center that hummed with purposeful activity. Tom had moved into the guest room permanently, his business acumen and organizational skills proving invaluable as their therapy program expanded to serve 5 counties. What had begun as 1 man and 1 dog had grown into a network of 12 certified therapy teams, all trained according to protocols that Sarah had helped develop during her final months. Jack stood on his familiar porch, coffee mug warming his hands, watching Tom work with Luna, a young golden retriever who'd been rescued from a puppy mill and was showing remarkable aptitude for therapy work. The sight of his brother's patient instruction, so different from the commanding military authority Jack remembered, demonstrated how profoundly healing could transform not just recipients but providers as well. Biscuit, now 5 pounds lighter and moving with the confident ease of a dog, secure in his purpose, supervised the training from his preferred spot in the shade. At 8 years old, he'd officially retired from active therapy work, but remained the program's senior advisor, somehow communicating wisdom to younger dogs through example and presence. "Miguel will be here at 10, Tom called out, consulting the schedule that governed their increasingly complex operations. "He's bringing 3 candidates from the halfway house, 2 men and 1 woman who've expressed interest in handler training." Miguel's transformation from inmate to program coordinator had been one of their most satisfying success stories. Released 8 months ago, he'd immediately requested to volunteer with the therapy program, bringing unique insights about healing from trauma and addiction. His reunion with Sophia had progressed slowly but steadily, father and daughter rebuilding their relationship through supervised visits that often included Biscuit's calming presence. The program's expansion had created opportunities Jack had never imagined. Veterans with PTSD worked alongside elderly volunteers. Former inmates partnered with retired teachers, and teenagers from troubled backgrounds found purpose in caring for animals who'd also survived difficult circumstances. The common thread was healing, not just for those they served, but for those who served. Dr. Chen's monthly evaluation had confirmed what Jack observed daily. The therapy work was creating measurable improvements in mental health, social connection, and community cohesion. But the statistics, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the deeper transformation that had occurred in Jack himself. The phone rang, interrupting his morning reflection. Pete Nordstrom's voice carried excitement that immediately caught Jack's attention. "Jack, you need to get down to the auction barn. They've got a situation here that made me think of you and Biscuit. There's this old German shepherd, maybe 10 years old, belonged to a veteran who passed last week. Family can't keep him, and nobody's bidding because of his age and some hip problems. But Jack, this dog has the same look Biscuit had, like he's waiting for someone who understands what he's really worth." 40 minutes later, Jack and Tom stood at the familiar auction barn where everything had begun. The German shepherd sat in his pen with dignity intact despite his circumstances, his graying muzzle and careful movements speaking of a lifetime of loyal service. His eyes held intelligence and patience, along with something Jack recognized immediately, the quiet resilience of a soul who'd learned to hope without demanding guarantees. "What do you think?" Tom asked, studying the dog with the analytical skills he'd once applied to cattle evaluations. "I think," Jack replied, "that some stories are worth repeating." The bidding was desultory. most buyers dismissed by the dog's age and obvious physical limitations. Jack waited until the auctioneer called for final bids, then raised his hand with the same instinctive certainty he'd felt with Biscuit. $25, he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the barn. The auctioneer looked around hopefully for competing bids, found none, and brought down his gavel with theatrical flourish. Sold to Jack Mallory for $25. Folks, if past experience is any guide, that might be the best investment made here today. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd, a sound that carried recognition rather than mockery. Jack's reputation had evolved. From the man who bought the dollar dog to the healer who sees potential where others see problems. As they loaded the German shepherd, whose papers identified him as Rex, into their truck, Jack reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The ranch that had once symbolized isolation and decline had become a center of healing and hope. The brother who'd seemed permanently lost to misunderstanding had become a true partner in work that mattered. Tom climbed into the passenger seat, his expression thoughtful. You know what strikes me most about all this? Dad always talked about leaving a legacy, building something that would last generations. But land and cattle, that's just property. What we're doing now, what you started with, Biscuit, this changes lives in ways that keep spreading long after we're gone. Rex settled between them with the grateful acceptance of an animal who recognized rescue when it appeared. His calm presence seemed to validate their choice, suggesting that healing would continue to find new forms and new expressions, as long as people remained willing to see beyond surface appearances to underlying potential. The drive home took them past landmarks that had witnessed Jack's transformation. The elementary school where children still asked when Biscuit would visit again. The nursing home where Mrs. Henderson maintained a photo gallery of therapy dogs who'd brightened her days. The community center where quarterly events continued to celebrate the expanding network of healing partnerships. At the ranch, Rex met Biscuit with the careful respect of one senior citizen acknowledging another. The introduction proceeded smoothly, both dogs seeming to understand that they were part of something larger than individual relationships, a community dedicated to the proposition that healing was always possible when accompanied by patience, kindness, and the willingness to try again. That evening, as Jack updated his ranch journal with Rex's arrival, he found himself writing words that captured the essence of everything he'd learned. Today, we welcomed another soul who needed second chances. Tomorrow, we'll begin discovering what gifts he has to offer. Some investments pay dividends in ways that can't be calculated, but can definitely be felt. Outside, the Montana sunset painted the mountains in familiar shades of gold and purple. But inside, the quiet house vibrated with purpose and possibility. Biscuit's therapy certification represented more than professional recognition. It stood as proof that the most important work in the world often began with simple decisions to care, to hope, and to believe that broken things could be made whole again. Jack's legacy would endure not in the land he'd preserved or the cattle he'd raised, but in the lives he'd touched, through the patient application of love to the wounded places where healing needed to happen. And in the morning that work would continue, carried forward by anyone willing to see the extraordinary potential hidden within the most ordinary acts of kindness.